I welcome the opportunity to speak on this anti-eviction Bill 2018, and I commend Solidarity People for Profit for bringing it forward and confirm my support for the bill. This bill, last Count Corley, is one of a number of bills and numerous motions, private members' motions here in this House over the last number of years. There's certainly hasn't been a month, and there's been housing issues on the agenda in this chamber on a weekly basis, I'd say, for the last two and a half years. But of course, the government are completely out of touch with the situation on the ground. They're supported by Fianna Fáil, who are again completely out of touch with the situation on the ground. They're effectively supporting an emergency housing crisis out there, both the government parties and Fianna Fáil, because that's what's happening out there. There's a huge emergency and a huge crisis out there, and we all know that. And the government policy and the policy of Fianna Fáil has been an absolute disastrous failure. And it's a policy that has, first of all, privatised local authority housing, started way back in the early 2000s with Fianna Fáil, and I can remember it well myself as a member of South Tipperary County Council at a housing meeting when that was announced. And many of us then and since have said that this would be a disaster, that it wouldn't work, that the private sector would never deliver the houses that were needed. And sadly and unfortunately, we have the proof of the pudding now, where we have 10,000 people, more than 10,000 people actually homeless, and 4,000 of those children, and a hugely disastrous situation for thousands and thousands upon families. Rather, McVery has said that this crisis is affecting about 500,000 people currently. So effectively, this government have, and the previous governments have effectively produced a housing policy that's relying on the private sector, that's relying on vulture funds, that's relying on developers, that's relying on landlords, and that policy has failed and has actually created the emergency that we have now. And you know, if the government would even listen to independent people, independent academics, independent organisations who are involved in the whole housing situation, each and every one of them have said that the whole area of private rented sector is a complete and absolute disaster, and that it's driving homelessness. We know that more than 50% of families who become homeless directly from the private rented sector. Only recently, Professor Tony Fahey from the School of Social Policy at UCD, said exactly that. And in fact, he said that 100 years after the Land League, where fair rent and fixity of tenure was the big issue, that issue is now back on the agenda today, 100 years later, in the private rented sector, for thousands upon thousands of families who are forced to rent privately, either directly payable to landlords or through the HAP scheme. And Professor Fahey has said that these tenants are going to suffer a lifetime of substantial rents for about 30% of families in this country. Professor Owen O'Sullivan has said as well, that exactly more than 50% of families becoming homeless are coming from the private rented sector. And he's also said that unless there is something done about the right to terminate tenancies, in other words, the right to evict people, unless that is stopped, that the flow into homelessness is going to continue. Niamh Randall of Simon has said the very same thing. She said that there can be no effective rent control while evictions from private rented dwellings continue. So Last Corla, I welcome this bill. Many of the issues in it I raised myself in a bill a number of weeks ago, and there's no doubt that this bill is absolutely essential if anything is to be done. Not to solve the housing problem, because this bill won't solve the housing problem, nor do the movers suggest that it will. But what it would do is that it would stop the situation getting worse. And the situation is getting worse, irrespective of what the Minister is going to tell us. And we know exactly what he'll tell us, because he's told us that the same thing a fortnight ago, and a fortnight before that, and a month before that, and for the last 2.5 years. The government policy is working. Well, the government policy isn't working. And anybody who has any bit of common sense, or any bit of grey matter between their ears, or anybody who is affected by the housing crisis out there, know that the government policy isn't working, and that it has to change, and that the issues raised in this bill in relation to, specifically in relation to evictions and to vacant possession, the sale of properties with vacant possession, these are absolutely essential matters to deal with if the situation isn't to get worse. So this bill will only deal with those areas, and it will only mean that the situation will not get worse. We need a huge emergency programme of the building of public housing on public land by local authorities if the housing situation is going to be tackled successfully. But that's something that this government have turned their face against. They continue to rely on landlords and vulture funds and developers rather than looking towards the local authorities and looking towards the building of large numbers of public housing on public land. Last Corla, I support the bill, and I commend the movers of this bill.